The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Horse Guards Parade as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his iconic red tunic for the third time. 23 years of service to the Crown had taught him that Tuesdays were usually quiet affairs, with only the occasional tourist attempting to make his horse flinch or snap an unauthorized selfie. He had no idea that this particular Tuesday would become the most talked-about incident in Royal Guard history, requiring 3 separate emergency protocols and leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about his duty. Morrison's horse, Wellington, stood perfectly still beneath him, ears twitching at the familiar sounds of central London awakening. The massive black gelding had been his partner for 4 years, and together they had weathered countless ceremonies, protests, and even a few minor security scares. Wellington was known among the guards for his unflappable nature, a horse that wouldn't budge even if a marching band paraded directly in front of him. This reputation would prove both blessing and curse in the hours to come. The first sign that something was amiss came at precisely 9:47 a.m., when Morrison noticed an unusual gathering near the entrance to St. James's Park. What appeared to be a small group of morning joggers had grown into a crowd of nearly 50 people, all pointing excitedly toward the Horse Guards building. Morrison's trained eye immediately picked out several individuals who seemed out of place, men in dark suits speaking urgently into earpieces, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd and surrounding buildings. Among the gathering crowd, a woman in a bright yellow jacket was gesticulating wildly, her voice carrying across the courtyard despite the distance. Morrison couldn't make out her words, but her obvious distress was causing a ripple effect through the growing assembly of onlookers. Children were being pulled closer to their parents, and several people had their phones out, not for the usual tourist photos, but seemingly recording something with genuine concern etched on their faces. Wellington shifted slightly beneath Morrison, a subtle movement that the experienced guardsman immediately recognized as his horse's way of acknowledging that something in their environment had changed. After 4 years together, Morrison had learned to read Wellington's body language like a second language. The horse's ears were no longer casually twitching at random sounds, but were instead fixed in the direction of the growing commotion, alert, and focused in a way that suggested he too sensed that this was no ordinary morning disturbance. The radio clipped to Morrison's belt crackled to life with the voice of his commanding officer, Captain Reynolds. The transmission was brief, but loaded with an undertone that Morrison had rarely heard in his superior's usually calm demeanor. Reynolds was requesting a status report from all mounted guards, asking specifically about any unusual observations or activities in their respective areas. Morrison pressed the response button, his voice steady and professional as he reported the growing crowd and the presence of what appeared to be plainclothes security personnel. As Morrison finished his radio transmission, he noticed that the woman in the yellow jacket had broken away from the main group and was walking directly toward him. Her pace was determined, almost urgent, and she carried what appeared to be a manila envelope clutched tightly in her right hand. Behind her, 2 of the men in dark suits had also begun moving, their casual surveillance stance shifting to something more active and purposeful. Morrison felt his pulse quicken slightly, his years of training automatically heightening his awareness of everything around him. The woman was now close enough that Morrison could see her face clearly. She appeared to be in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and worry lines creasing her forehead. More importantly, Morrison could see that her hands were shaking as she approached, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of genuine fear, rather than the excitement or curiosity he typically saw in tourists. Whatever she carried in that envelope, whatever had driven her to seek out a royal guard on duty, it was something she believed to be of critical importance. Wellington's ears flicked backward briefly, a sign that the horse was checking in with. His rider, sensing the tension that was beginning to build in Morrison's posture, the guardsman's right hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the radio on his belt, not yet ready to call for backup, but preparing for that possibility. Years of experience had taught him that when civilians approached with that particular combination of determination and fear, it usually meant trouble was not far behind. The distance between the woman and Morrison's position continued to close, and with each step, the sergeant found himself running through various scenarios and protocols in his mind. Was she carrying a complaint about guard conduct? Did she have information about a security threat? Was she simply another member of the public with an unusual request or question? The envelope in her hand seemed too thick for a simple letter, and the way she gripped it suggested its contents were either very valuable or very dangerous. The woman in the yellow jacket came to a stop directly in front of Wellington, close enough that Morrison could smell her perfume mixed with the sharp scent of perspiration. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, as if she had been running, though. Morrison had watched her walk the entire distance from the crowd. Up close, he could see that her clothes were wrinkled and her makeup was smudged, suggesting she had been awake for far longer than was healthy. "Sergeant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying an urgency that made Morrison lean forward slightly in his saddle. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I work for the Ministry of Defense. I have information that concerns the safety of the royal family, and I believe there may be people trying to stop me from delivering it to the proper authorities." Morrison's training kicked in immediately. Direct threats to the royal family triggered specific protocols, regardless of how unlikely or unusual the source might appear. His hand moved to his radio, but Dr. Chen quickly held up her free hand in a gesture that begged him to wait. The envelope in her other hand was shaking more noticeably now, and Morrison could see what appeared to be official government seals along its edges. "Doctor, I need you to step back from my horse and speak with the guards at the gate," Morrison replied, his voice maintaining the professional neutrality required of his position, while his eyes scanned the crowd behind her. The two men in dark suits had moved closer and were now standing perhaps 20 feet away, no longer making any pretense of casual observation. Their attention was fixed entirely on Dr. Chen, and their body language suggested they were prepared to intervene at any moment. Dr. Chen followed Morrison's gaze toward the men, and her face went pale. "Those men have been following me since yesterday evening," she said, her voice now dropping to barely audible levels. "I've tried to reach my supervisors, but every phone call is being intercepted, and when I went to my office this morning, my security access had been revoked. Sergeant, whatever is in this envelope, someone very powerful wants to make sure it never reaches its intended destination." Wellington snorted softly, a sound that Morrison knew indicated the horse was picking up on the tension of the humans around him. The gelding's training was as thorough as any guardsman's, and he had been taught to remain calm even in threatening situations. But Morrison could feel the subtle changes in the horse's posture that suggested Wellington was preparing for the possibility of sudden movement. The radio on Morrison's belt crackled again, this time with a different voice, one he didn't immediately recognize. The transmission was asking all guards to report any contact with a Dr. Sarah Chen and to detain her for questioning if she approached their positions. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that somehow the very woman standing in front of him had become the subject of an active security alert. Dr. Chen must have heard the radio transmission because her eyes widened with what Morrison could only describe as terror. "They're using official channels to hunt me down," she whispered. "Sergeant, I'm going to hand you this envelope, and I need you to promise me you'll get it to someone you trust completely. Don't use normal communication channels. Don't follow standard protocols. Whatever is happening here goes much deeper than anyone realizes." Morrison found himself in an impossible situation. His training demanded that he follow the radio instructions and detain Dr. Chen, but something about her demeanor and the obvious fear in her eyes made him hesitate. In 23 years of service, he had developed an instinct for reading people, and every fiber of his being told him that this woman was genuinely terrified and genuinely believed she was trying to protect rather than harm. The two men in dark suits were now moving again, their casual surveillance abandoned entirely in favor of a direct approach. Morrison could see that they were speaking into their own communication devices, and their pace had increased significantly. Behind them, the crowd that had initially gathered near the park entrance was beginning to disperse, as if some invisible signal had been given to clear the area. Dr. Chen extended the envelope toward Morrison, her hand trembling so violently that she nearly dropped it. "Inside this envelope are photographs and documents that prove someone within the security services is planning something terrible," she said, her words coming in a rushed whisper. "I've spent 3 days trying to get this information to the right people, but everyone I trust has either been reassigned, is suddenly unavailable, or claims they've never heard of me." Morrison's mind was racing through possibilities and protocols. Taking the envelope would mean disobeying a direct order that had come through official channels. Refusing it might mean allowing a genuine threat to the royal family to go unreported. Wellington shifted beneath him again, this time more noticeably, as if the horse could sense his rider's internal conflict, and was offering silent support for whatever decision had to be made. The men in dark suits were now close enough that Morrison could see their faces clearly. They were both young, probably in their 30s, with the kind of physical fitness and alertness that suggested military or intelligence backgrounds. Neither man appeared to be armed with visible weapons, but their coordinated movement and constant communication suggested they were part of a larger operation. Morrison made his decision. Rather than taking the envelope directly, he used his radio to call for his commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, specifically requesting an immediate consultation about a sensitive matter requiring senior judgment. It was a compromise that bought time without directly violating orders, while also ensuring that someone with more authority would have to make the ultimate decision about Dr. Chen and her mysterious envelope. Captain Reynolds arrived at Morrison's position within minutes, his usual composed demeanor showing signs of strain that Morrison had never seen before. The captain's eyes immediately took in the scene, Dr. Chen still standing beside Wellington. With her envelope, the two men in dark suits maintaining their watchful distance, and the gradually dispersing crowd that had initially drawn attention to the situation. "Sergeant Morrison, I need you to step down from your horse and accompany Dr. Chen to the guardhouse immediately," Reynolds said, his voice carrying an odd tension that made Morrison pause. "There are some people who need to speak with both of you, and this matter needs to be resolved quickly and quietly." Dr. Chen's reaction to Captain Reynolds was immediate and alarming. She took several steps backward, shaking her head vigorously, and clutched the envelope even more tightly to her chest. "Captain, with all due respect, I cannot go to any official building or speak with any official personnel until this information reaches someone I know I can trust," she said, her voice rising slightly, despite her obvious efforts to remain calm. Morrison dismounted from Wellington following his captain's orders, while keeping his attention divided between Dr. Chen and the approaching men in suits. As his boots touched the cobblestones, he noticed that Captain Reynolds was sweating despite the cool morning air, and there was something in his superior's eyes that looked almost like fear. "Doctor, I understand your concerns," Reynolds continued, his voice taking on a more soothing tone. "But you must realize that standing in the middle of Horse Guards parade with classified documents is not the solution to whatever problem you believe exists. We have secure facilities and proper protocols for handling sensitive information." The envelope in Dr. Chen's hands seemed to weigh more than paper and photographs should. Morrison found himself staring at it, wondering what could possibly be inside that would justify the extraordinary scene unfolding around him. In his 2 decades of service, he had witnessed ceremonies, protests, security alerts, and even a few genuine emergencies, but nothing had ever felt quite like this combination of official urgency and underlying dread. Wellington remained perfectly still behind Morrison, but the horse's ears were constantly moving, tracking the voices and movements of everyone in the immediate area. The gelding's training included remaining calm during unusual situations, but Morrison could sense that even his unflappable partner was aware that something significant was happening. Dr. Chen looked directly at Morrison, her eyes pleading for understanding. "Sergeant, 3 days ago, I discovered that someone has been using Ministry of Defense resources to track the movements of certain members of the royal family. Not for protection, but for something else entirely. When I tried to report this through proper channels, my access was revoked. My phone calls were blocked, and people I've worked with for years suddenly claimed they didn't know me." Captain Reynolds stepped closer to Dr. Chen, his hand moving toward the radio on his belt. "Doctor, these are very serious allegations, and they need to be investigated through proper channels. Standing here in public is not going to solve anything, and you're creating a security situation that could have serious consequences." Morrison noticed that the two men in dark suits had moved even closer and were now within hearing distance of the conversation. Something about their positioning bothered him. They were close enough to intervene quickly, but not close enough to be obviously threatening. It was the kind of positioning that trained security personnel used when they wanted to be ready for action while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Dr. Chen noticed the men's proximity at the same time Morrison did, and her breathing became even more rapid. "Captain, those men have been following me for over 36 hours. They're not official protection, and they're not here to help. Every time I've tried to reach someone in authority, they've appeared shortly afterward, and official doors that should be open to me have suddenly been closed." The radio traffic around Horse Guards had increased significantly in the past few minutes, with multiple voices requesting status updates and coordination information. Morrison could hear references to the situation and the package terms. That seemed to refer directly to Dr. Chen and her envelope. What troubled him most was that the radio chatter sounded more like a manhunt than a routine security consultation. Captain Reynolds was now standing between Dr. Chen and Morrison, effectively blocking any direct communication between them. "Sergeant, I need you to return to your duties," he said firmly. "Dr. Chen will be coming with me to sort out this matter properly. There's been enough disruption to normal operations." But Dr. Chen was no longer looking at Captain Reynolds. Her attention was fixed on something behind Morrison, and the expression on her face had shifted from fear to something approaching panic. Morrison turned to see what had captured her attention and saw that 4 additional men in similar dark clothing had appeared at various points around the perimeter of their location. They weren't obviously coordinating with each other, but their positioning was too strategic to be coincidental. "Sergeant Morrison," Dr. Chen said, her voice now barely audible, "I'm going to drop this envelope at your feet. Whether you pick it up or not is your choice, but I need you to know that everything that happens after this moment is being orchestrated by people who do not have the royal family's best interests at heart." Wellington whinnied softly behind Morrison, a sound that the sergeant recognized as his horse's way of expressing unease about the human drama unfolding around them. The sound seemed to break some of the tension that had been building, reminding everyone present that they were conducting this extraordinary conversation in one of the most public and symbolic locations in London. Captain Reynolds moved toward Dr. Chen with obvious intent to physically escort her away from the scene, but she had already begun to crouch down, preparing to place the envelope on the cobblestones at Morrison's feet. The movement triggered immediate responses from all 6 of the men in dark clothing, who began moving toward their position with unmistakable purpose. The envelope hit the cobblestones with a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the tense silence that had fallen over the group. Morrison stared down at it, acutely aware that picking it up would represent a choice that could define the rest of his career and possibly his life. The manila envelope lay there innocuously, its government seals catching the morning sunlight, while 6 men in dark clothing continued their coordinated approach from different directions. Dr. Chen straightened up slowly, her hands now empty but shaking even more violently than before. "Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying across the space between them with crystal clarity, "in that envelope are photographs of surveillance equipment that has been installed in locations where it should not exist, along with intercepts of communications that suggest something terrible is being planned for next week's state dinner." Captain Reynolds lunged forward, clearly intending to retrieve the envelope before Morrison could make any decision about it, but his movement was interrupted by the sudden appearance of two more figures, uniformed Metropolitan Police officers who seemed to have materialized from nowhere. Their presence changed the dynamic of the entire situation, as the men in dark clothing were forced to slow their approach and maintain the pretense that they were merely concerned citizens. Morrison found himself at the center of what was rapidly becoming a standoff. The envelope at his feet seemed to pulse with significance, while around him various factions of law enforcement and intelligence personnel tried to position themselves advantageously without creating an obvious public disturbance. Wellington stood behind him like a massive, patient anchor, the horse's presence somehow grounding Morrison in the surreal situation. One of the Metropolitan Police officers approached Morrison directly. "Sergeant, we've received reports of a security incident involving classified materials. We're going to need everyone to remain calm while we sort this out properly." The officer's tone was professional, but carried an undertone that suggested he was as confused about the situation as Morrison was. Dr. Chen looked at the police officers with what appeared to be relief mixed with continued apprehension. "Officers, I am Dr. Sarah Chen, and I work for the Ministry of Defense. I have been trying to report a serious security breach through official channels, but my access has been systematically blocked. The documents in that envelope contain evidence of unauthorized surveillance and what appears to be planning for an operation that could endanger members of the royal family." The second police officer was speaking quietly into his radio, requesting additional units and supervisory personnel. Morrison could hear fragments of the transmission, including references to potential terrorism intelligence and multiple agencies involved. The situation was clearly escalating beyond anything that could be handled by the personnel currently present. Captain Reynolds had stepped back from the envelope, but was watching Morrison intently, as if trying to communicate something without words. The expression on his captain's face was one Morrison had never seen before, a combination of urgency, confusion, and what looked like genuine concern for Morrison's well-being. It was the look of a man who found himself caught between conflicting orders and unclear loyalties. The men in dark clothing had stopped their advance, but were maintaining their positions, creating a loose perimeter around the group. Morrison noted that they were all speaking into communication devices and seemed to be receiving instructions from somewhere else. Their coordination was too precise to be spontaneous, suggesting they were part of a planned operation rather than an improvised response. Wellington shifted his weight behind Morrison, a movement that reminded the sergeant that he was still technically on duty and responsible for maintaining his post. The absurdity of the situation struck him. He was a royal guard whose primary job was to sit motionless on his horse for hours at a time, yet somehow he had become the focal point of what appeared to be a multi-agency intelligence operation. "Dr." Chen addressed Morrison directly, ignoring everyone else present. "Sergeant, I know this is an impossible situation for you, but I need you to understand that normal protocols have been compromised. The people who should be protecting the royal family are the ones planning to harm them. That envelope contains proof, but only if it reaches someone who isn't part of the conspiracy." The word conspiracy seemed to hang in the air, transforming what had been a confusing but potentially routine security matter into something far more serious. Morrison could see the effect it had on everyone present. The police officers exchanged concerned glances, Captain Reynolds visibly tensed, and the men in dark clothing began moving again, albeit more cautiously. Morrison made his second critical decision of the morning. Instead of picking up the envelope or leaving it for someone else to handle, he activated his radio and called for the most senior authority he could think of, the colonel of the regiment. It was an unprecedented step that would bring the highest levels of military command into whatever was unfolding. But Morrison's instincts told him that this situation required the kind of authority that could cut through competing jurisdictions and unclear loyalties. The radio crackled with Morrison's transmission, and within moments responses began coming from multiple sources. The colonel's aide confirmed that the colonel was en route, but also indicated that several other high-ranking officials were being notified simultaneously. Morrison realized that his call had probably triggered emergency protocols that would bring representatives from various branches of security and intelligence services to horse guards within the hour. Dr. Chen seemed to understand the implications of Morrison's radio call, and for the first time since their encounter began, she smiled slightly. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said quietly. "You may have just saved more lives than you realize." But Captain Reynolds was looking increasingly agitated, and Morrison noticed that he kept glancing toward the men in dark clothing as if seeking guidance or reassurance. The realization that his own commanding officer might be involved in whatever conspiracy Dr. Chen had discovered sent a chill through Morrison that had nothing to do with the morning air. The arrival of the colonel's convoy transformed Horse Guards Parade from a tourist destination into what resembled a military command center. 3 black vehicles swept into the courtyard with an authority that immediately commanded the attention of everyone present, including the growing crowd of onlookers who had begun to gather at the periphery of the unfolding drama. Colonel William Hartley emerged from the lead vehicle with the bearing of a man accustomed to making decisions in crisis situations. His eyes quickly assessed the scene. Morrison, standing at attention beside Wellington, the envelope still lying on the cobblestones, Dr. Chen flanked by police officers, Captain Reynolds looking increasingly uncomfortable, and the men in dark clothing who were now trying to blend into the background. Morrison felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as his ultimate commanding officer approached. Colonel Hartley had a reputation for fairness and integrity that was legendary within the regiment, but he also had little patience for breaches of protocol or unnecessary drama. The decision to call him directly over the heads of intermediate command was either going to be vindicated or result in Morrison facing serious disciplinary action. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Hartley said as he approached, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. "I understand you have a situation that requires senior attention. Brief me on what has transpired." Morrison delivered a concise summary of the morning's events, from Dr. Chen's initial approach through the arrival of the various personnel who were now watching their conversation with obvious interest. He was careful to stick to observable facts rather than speculation, but he also made sure to mention Dr. Chen's claims about unauthorized surveillance and threats to the royal family. Colonel Hartley listened without interruption, his experienced eyes noting details that Morrison hadn't even consciously observed. The colonel's attention lingered on the men in dark clothing, and Morrison could see recognition in his superior's expression, not of the individuals themselves, but of the type of operatives they represented. Dr. Chen stepped forward, addressing Colonel Hartley directly. "Sir, I realize this situation appears unusual, but I have spent the last 3 days attempting to report critical intelligence through proper channels, only to find those channels systematically blocked. The documents in that envelope represent evidence of a serious threat to national security that someone within the system is actively trying to suppress." Colonel Hartley examined Dr. Chen with the same attention he had given to everything else about the situation. "Doctor, you will forgive me if I find it curious that a Ministry of Defense employee would choose to deliver sensitive intelligence to a mounted guard in a public square rather than through established security protocols." The question hung in the air as Dr. Chen prepared her response, but before she could speak, Captain Reynolds stepped forward with obvious urgency. "Colonel, I believe Dr. Chen may be experiencing some form of mental health crisis. Her claims about conspiracy and surveillance are characteristic of paranoid delusions, and she may pose a threat to herself or others." Morrison felt his stomach drop as he heard his immediate commanding officer essentially accusing Dr. Chen of being mentally unstable. The suggestion would provide a convenient explanation for dismissing everything she had said, but it also felt like a betrayal of the genuine fear and desperation Morrison had witnessed in her behavior. Dr. Chen's reaction to Captain Reynolds' statement was immediate and intense. "Captain Reynolds, you know exactly why I cannot use normal channels," she said, her voice rising despite her obvious efforts to remain composed. "You were present at the briefing where we discussed the security vulnerabilities I discovered, and you were the one who assured me that the matter would be investigated properly." The implication of Dr. Chen's words hit Morrison like a physical blow. If Captain Reynolds had been involved in suppressing her attempts to report the intelligence she claimed to possess, then the conspiracy she described might extend directly into Morrison's own chain of command. The realization left him feeling isolated and uncertain about who could be trusted. Colonel Hartley's expression had changed subtly as he listened to the exchange between Dr. Chen and Captain Reynolds. Morrison could see that his commanding officer was processing implications and connections that might not be obvious to everyone present. The colonel's hand moved to his communication device, and he spoke quietly into it, using codes that Morrison didn't recognize. Within minutes of the colonel's transmission, 2 additional vehicles arrived at Horse Guards Parade. These were unmarked, but clearly official, and the personnel who emerged from them had the bearing of intelligence operatives rather than military or police. Morrison watched as they approached Colonel Hartley and engaged in a brief, intense conversation that he couldn't overhear. Dr. Chen noticed the arrival of the new personnel and her composure, which had been maintained through increasingly difficult circumstances, finally began to crack. "Colonel, those people are part of the problem," she said, her voice now carrying a note of desperation that Morrison found genuinely heartbreaking. "Every time I've tried to report what I discovered, people like them have appeared to shut down the conversation." Morrison found himself in the extraordinary position of watching his commanding officer navigate what appeared to be competing interests within Britain's security apparatus. Colonel Hartley was clearly aware that the situation had implications, far beyond a simple security breach, and his handling of the various parties suggested he was trying to protect legitimate interests while avoiding being manipulated by those with hidden agendas. The envelope still lay on the cobblestones between Morrison and the gathered officials, untouched, but somehow central to everything that was happening. Morrison realized that whatever decision was made about that envelope would determine not only Dr. Chen's fate, but possibly the safety of the royal family and the integrity of the institutions he had sworn to protect. Wellington stood patiently behind Morrison throughout the increasingly complex negotiations, the horse's presence serving as a reminder of the traditional values and steadfast loyalty that Morrison had always believed defined his service to the crown. Colonel Hartley made a decision that would be analyzed and debated in security circles for years to come. Instead of allowing any of the competing factions to take control of the envelope or Dr. Chen, he declared the entire area a military security zone and ordered everyone except essential personnel to withdraw to a safe distance. His authority as colonel of the regiment gave him the power to make such a declaration, but Morrison could see that it created immediate tension with the intelligence operatives who had just arrived. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Hartley said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "you will retrieve that envelope and place it in my hands directly. Dr. Chen, you will remain here under military protection until we can properly evaluate your claims and ensure your safety. Everyone else will step back and allow us to handle this matter according to military protocol." Morrison bent down and picked up the envelope, feeling its weight and noting that it was indeed quite thick with whatever documents it contained. As he handed it to Colonel Hartley, he noticed that Dr. Chen's expression had changed from desperation to something approaching hope for the first time since their encounter had begun. The intelligence operatives who had arrived in the unmarked vehicles were clearly unhappy with Colonel Hartley's decision to assert military jurisdiction over the situation. Morrison could see them engaging in urgent conversations with their supervisors via communication devices, and their body language suggested they were receiving instructions to challenge the colonel's authority. Captain Reynolds approached Colonel Hartley with obvious concern. "Sir, I must respectfully suggest that involving the military directly in what may be an intelligence matter could create jurisdictional complications that might compromise ongoing operations." His words were carefully chosen, but Morrison could hear the underlying tension in his voice. Colonel Hartley opened the envelope and began examining its contents, his expression becoming increasingly grave as he reviewed the documents and photographs inside. Morrison watched his commanding officer's face and saw recognition, concern, and what appeared to be anger pass across his features in rapid succession. "Captain Reynolds," Colonel Hartley said, without looking up from the documents, "you are hereby relieved of duty pending a full investigation into your knowledge of and possible involvement in the matters described in these materials. You will report to headquarters immediately and remain available for questioning." The words hit Morrison like a thunderbolt. His immediate commanding officer was being relieved of duty based on whatever evidence Colonel Hartley had found in Dr. Chen's envelope. The implications were staggering. If Captain Reynolds was indeed involved in a conspiracy against the royal family, then Morrison's decision to call for higher authority had potentially prevented a catastrophic security breach. Dr. Chen, visibly, sagged with relief as she heard Colonel Hartley's words. "Thank you, Colonel," she said quietly. "I was beginning to think no one in authority could be trusted to put the safety of the royal family above institutional politics or personal interests." The intelligence operatives made one final attempt to assert their authority over the situation, approaching Colonel Hartley with what appeared to be official documentation demanding custody of both Dr. Chen and the envelope. Morrison watched as his commanding officer examined their credentials and then firmly but politely declined their request. "Gentlemen," Colonel Hartley said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "the protection of the royal family is the primary responsibility of my regiment, and these documents suggest a direct threat to that mission. Until I am satisfied that proper security measures have been implemented and all conspirators have been identified, Dr. Chen will remain under military protection, and these materials will be handled through military channels." Wellington, who had remained perfectly still throughout the extraordinary events of the morning, finally moved, turning his head to look directly at Morrison as if to acknowledge that his rider had successfully navigated an impossible situation. The horse's simple gesture somehow conveyed approval and solidarity, reminding Morrison that he had stayed true to his oath to protect the crown regardless of the personal cost. Within hours, the investigation that began with Dr. Chen's envelope would uncover a network of compromised personnel that extended through multiple branches of Britain's security services. The plot she had discovered involved not an assassination attempt, but something potentially more damaging: a plan to use insider knowledge of royal family movements and security protocols to embarrass and undermine the monarchy through a series of carefully orchestrated security failures. Morrison would later learn that his decision to call Colonel Hartley directly had been the critical factor in preventing the conspiracy from succeeding. By bringing the highest levels of military authority into the situation immediately, he had short-circuited the conspirators' ability to control the flow of information and manipulate the response. The incident would become legendary within the Royal Guard, though the full details would remain classified for decades. Morrison would be commended for his judgment and integrity, while Captain Reynolds and several others would face court-martial proceedings. Dr. Chen would be relocated to a secure position within a different branch of government service, her expertise valued, but her safety requiring ongoing protection. Years later, when Morrison finally retired from the Royal Guard, He would often reflect on that Tuesday morning when a woman in a yellow jacket had approached his post with an envelope. That changed everything. He would remember Wellington's steady presence, Colonel Hartley's decisive leadership, and his own moment of choosing between blind obedience to immediate orders and loyalty to the deeper principles his service represented. It was the day when being a royal guard meant more than sitting motionless on a horse. It meant making choices that protected not just the physical safety of the royal family, but the integrity of the institutions that made their protection meaningful.